When the Ottoman Empire captured Christian women, it didn't always kill them. There was something considered more efficient than death, a silent process that erased names, faith, and identity, all recorded in official books. This video isn't about a massacre. It's about an administrative ritual that transformed people into absences. The last bell tolled high above the valley, a single, stubborn sound that seemed to hold the convent's whole life in its echo. Smoke threaded the morning light. Red banners moved like strange flowers over stone. Inside, the sisters stood in a small room that had not yet learned the vocabulary of defeat. They held their books, their veils, the small brass crucifixes that had been warmed by dozens of hands in prayer. They did not know then that the more dangerous thing awaiting them was not the instant of violence, but the slow, unromantic machinery that would follow, a machinery designed not only to take bodies, but to make names disappear. If you follow archive-driven histories, subscribe. We dig into documents others forget. The assault came at dawn. Men with the colors of the empire in their scarves moved through the convent's courtyard with the businesslike thoroughness of soldiers and clerks. The frescoes had not been entirely blackened when the first door was forced, and the first lamp was dashed to the floor. The abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, met them where she had met 100 crises before, standing in the nave, hands unclasped, voice as small and certain as a bell. "I have already given my life," she said, and the sentence is preserved in a later account as a piece of testimony grafted onto memory. What followed was not merely the breaking of a place of worship, but the process of separating persons from the identities that had bound them into a community. 22 women departed the convent that day under escort. Some were young enough that the convent had been the only home they had known. Some had faces that were already mapped by grief. They were marched down from the hills to Volos, eyes narrowed against salt wind, feet blistered on the road, the landscape shrinking on either side until the sea opened, and a new enclosure, the hold of a transport, became their world. A name appears in a single line of paper and has the power to render a life legible or invisible. On the voyage, the task of transforming people into inventory fell practically to a man named Yosef Ager. He appears in a ledger kept for the imperial household, a careful, bureaucratic hand cataloging goods, provisions, and the occasional human cargo deemed suitable for transfer. The ledger lists spices, bolts of cloth, and then, as if logistics were continuous, the names of captives, a column for origin, a column for condition, a final column where a notation might mean release, reassignment, or nothing at all.
The hand that wrote from Thessaly also crossed out names in another page with an economy that reads like a sentence. The strike of ink is a jurisdiction. Arrival in Constantinople turned the private terror of capture into the public theater of empire. The women were led before the Grand Vizier's council, and there, amid polished marble and the hum of courtiers, they stood not as a convent, but as cases. Mercy, as it was offered by those who administered imperial law, came with a condition. Records from a courtier's diary recount brisk negotiations, mercy in exchange for assimilation. The empire's power did not always show itself in immediate execution or spectacle. Often it took a quieter, more persistent form. The official spoke of a discipline of faith, a phrase that surfaces in archival traces like a legal term of art, ambiguous and procedural. What exactly that phrase encompassed is sometimes dressed in the polite euphemisms of administrators: retraining, repurposing, disposed. Those words should be heard for what they are, language of statecraft that smooths over personal violence. This is the place where the title's promise of a secret ritual requires careful translation. The ritual here was not a ceremony of candles and incantations. It was a procedural choreography, measured kindness, calculated isolation, the repetition of phrases until they took the place of a name. A woman might be addressed at first with gentle courtesy, a new robe, a coaxing question, a cup of wine poured by a hand that measured the margin of resistance. The ledger would note toleration. Later, the same records might show a name altered on a roster, an original appellation replaced with one that fit a new household, a new language for a new function. To be renamed in these registers was not merely to be called something else, it was to be refiled in the empire's memory. Some women accepted this transaction and thus vanished into the palace's opaque workings. The chronicle of the twin sisters from Corfu is brief and chilling in its lacuna. 2 names entered, 2 names later absent from any roster of return. A Venetian correspondent who wrote from the docks of the Bosphorus jotted a sentence under a column of trade. 2 women taken into service, names thereafter untraceable. The trend in the papers is a formal disappearance, records that record nothing, and in those blank spaces the state's erasure is legible. Others resisted in ways that were both immediate and stubbornly ordinary. Sister Dearest, an older woman, refused to adopt a new name before the council. She stood with the sort of quiet force that archives like to remark upon, an unteachable obstinacy, Accordio wrote, and he meant it as both annoyance and admiration. She spoke to the officials with a voice that refused to be whitened by the terms they offered. Where the records used discipline, Dearest used silence and direct speech.
Her refusal did not produce a dramatic martyrdom in the public square. It produced instead an administrative response that was as efficient as it was clouded, a notation that she was unfit for palace service, and a transfer to labor in a distant household. The file grows thin there. The bureaucratic euphemism performs its work by removing the person's place from the narrative. The empire's method was calibrated to make resistance fade without the need for spectacle. Scholars reading the office registers have suggested that kindness was part of the test. Invitations to speak the new tongue, to attend meals where the liturgy of the other culture was performed in its gentle modernness, to accept a name that fit the palace roster. These were not merely social overtures. The records suggest they were stages in a process, each small acceptance narrowing the fields in which a woman could protest. An official's entry might note that a captive learned to answer to the new name, an apparently benign observation that, read against other documents, reads like an act of folding a human life into administration. But where ink attempted to smooth the rough human outline, stones sometimes resisted more effectively. Beneath the corridors of power, in the spaces people assume can be controlled and catalogued, something stubborn persisted. Archaeologists working in later centuries found carved crosses in an unexpected place, low chambers that had been sealed off and forgotten, blank walls upon which someone had made a rapid, private act of devotion. The crosses were accompanied by small emblems, birds, a line suggesting a flame, and a short Latin phrase that did not echo the court's languages. The discovery was catalogued not as a headline item, but as a detail in the archaeological register. Yet the detail speaks with the force of counter-evidence. What the empire could not name, hands could still mark into stone. Those marks tell a story of everyday resistance that was not theatrical, but intimate. Sister Magdalena, a younger nun whose name is preserved in a few later letters, is credited by witnesses with keeping memory alive. She is not the loud heroine of legend. She is a keeper of small things. Her acts were the sorts that leave faint footprints, teaching the younger women a prayer by the cadence of their lips, carving a tiny cross into the underside of a bench with the dull point of a spoon, passing scraps of old hymns in the dark. When the women could not gather in the open, they convened in hunger and in whispers beneath the palace, creating a subterranean liturgy made of memory and gesture. Their chapel was not appointed with altars and priestly vestments, but with the pledge of shared recall, compacts to speak the old names when danger permitted, to let the psalms pass from mouth to mouth like a secret heirloom. The methods of survival were pragmatic and meticulous.
In the dark, a small group scratched out a calendar in their heads, a psalm for each night, a saint for each hidden day. They developed a system of symbols, a bird for hope, a flame for endurance, and placed those marks where the foot of a guard might not see them at all. In one excavated stairwell, a sequence of tiny nicks forms a pattern that some scholars interpret as a mnemonic device for prayer. A courtier's diary, written in the flurry of state business and rumor, mentions a group of women who whisper in the cellars. The phrase is brief, almost accusatory, but it confirms that not all constraint was totalizing. The ledger and the stone converge to tell us what the state could not fully accomplish. Administrative erasure required 2 things: the removal of a name from a roster and the removal of that name from social memory. The first was a matter of ink. The second required a heavier hand. But memory has its own durability. Where the registers fall silent, carvings and whispered customs speak. This is not to say that the empire's apparatus was benign.
The apparatus was efficient, and it understood the power of paperwork. Among the most striking pieces of evidence is the manner in which ledgers themselves were used as instruments of erasure. There are pages preserved in the Istanbul archives where names are entered and then left blank in subsequent columns. Sometimes a notation in a marginal hand announces a transfer to service, a phrase used with discouraging frequency. Other times the ledger simply stops providing updates, as if the act of omission were itself a bureaucratic sentence. Historians have a term for this: negative evidence. Where there is nothing recorded, that silence can be read, cautiously, as testimony. A Venetian letter describes the paradox precisely. Their names appear in the ledger, then they are as if under the sea. That is the functional end of the administrative ritual, to render human life as expendable as a line on a page. The discipline of faith, then, was a bureaucratic choreography that worked in stages. First, a presentation of mercy, an offer to live, to work, to be integrated, if a person would adopt new forms of speech and serve new masters. Second, a period of testing, in which the captive's compliance was observed and recorded. Third, renaming and reassignment, when a person's name and social place were reissued on the empire's terms. Fourth, the archival erasure, margins left empty, overseers noting the change and making no further entries. Each step is visible in fragments: a ledger entry here, a courtier's scribble there, a sailor's letter her boss the strait. Alone, each fragment is faint. Together they begin to outline an administrative ritual. And yet, within this process, there remained room for human unpredictability.
The twins from Corfu, whose names cross from a list of captives into a vacuum, were said by one Venetian observer to be taken into a lady's service, where the days swallowed their names. A later excavation in a small palace turned up a ribbon of coral beads and a scrap of embroidered linen that might once have been theirs. The material evidence cannot speak names, but it suggests lives that continued, albeit in ways the convent could not trace. Meanwhile, Sister Diaris's stubbornness meant she was industriously erased from the records by reassignment to hard labor. Her life becomes an example of how the state sidestepped confrontation. Administrative sentences were often designed to neutralize the moral force of resistance by changing its terms, a voice silenced by reclassification. The moral gravity of this bureaucratic ritual is its aim at identity. Where death ends life's story, erasure aims to end the story's telling. That is why some contemporaries and later commentators used the language of being worse than death. They did not mean that the captive suffered worse physical pain in every case. They meant something more existential. To have your name removed from the ledger of your community is to be removed from collective memory. A state could keep bodies and redistribute them. What it was harder to control was the memory held in other hearts. The convent's women understood this. Their insistence on carving crosses into stone, on teaching hymns to one another in the hush beneath the palace, on preserving names as liturgical invocations, was a refusal to be administratively refiled. Sometimes resistance was as simple as keeping language alive. The forced phrases imposed upon captives, the polite greetings in a new tongue, the names given at a new hearth, were a form of social pressure that, if repeated enough, could displace older speech. But the nuns devised strategies to keep older speech breathing. When a guard asked a woman to answer by a new name, she might comply outwardly, and yet in a corner of the room or at night under her breath, speak the old name like a prayer. A carved cross near the stairwell bore, according to a catalogue entry, a faint Latin inscription, Nomen nostrum vivit, our name lives. That inscription is a small and stubborn indictment of the ledger's ambitions. The archival material itself raises difficult interpretive choices. Officials used words that softened the operation: discipline, training, reassignment. Those are the very words that historians must treat with suspicion. They are euphemisms that mask the coercive hedge beneath. When a scribe writes relinquished next to a name, that might mean consent, or it might mean something enforced.
The proper stance, given the fragmentary nature of evidence, is to lean toward careful inference rather than wild assertion. The records suggest a process. Letters from Venice corroborate that women were taken into service and later untraceable. Carved crosses and clandestine symbols show that memory was being preserved in hidden places. The tension between index and artifact, ink and stone, becomes the emotional center of the story. In the palace, a clerk could close a book and call an erasure complete. Outside of clerical spaces, however, the human impulse to mark a life in the world found other media. The bird and flame motifs scratched into a stair's underside are not institutional documents. They are acts of presence. They testify to a people who, denied the right to speak in public, chose to leave marks where the state's eye would not easily reach. One of the most affecting details is the pattern of little rituals the women developed to maintain identity. They would touch a certain tile before sharing a secret. They would fold the corner of a garment in a particular way that only other former nuns would recognize. They would hum an old hymn line that had been learned as children. These were, in a sense, counter-rituals, not practiced in order to be seen, but to keep shared memory coherent. A courtier's diary mentions, in passing, a song that will not die. It is the sort of marginal note that archives love precisely because it reveals human persistence.
The empire's bureaucratic rituals sought to reclassify and rename. The nuns' counter-rituals sought to remember. Both sets of practices were ordinary in their own bureaucratic ways. Officials with ink and paper, women with prayer and scratches on stone. Both were quiet, and both were consequential. There is an ethical imperative in recounting these moments from the archive. We must resist the temptation to dramatize what the records do not support. We must also resist the temptation to reduce the actors to caricature. The Ottoman officials were administrators whose actions were part of larger imperial logics. The nuns were human beings whose acts of memory complicate any simple narrative of victimhood alone. Their resistance was not always spectacular. It was often tactical, made of small acts that cumulatively resisted erasure. When modern observers call the empire's practice worse than death, the phrase should be read as a moral claim about the value of naming and remembering. Official erasure wanted to make certain lives illegible. The surviving stones and brittle pages refused to grant that definitive nullity. The ledger's silence is answered, imperfectly but insistently, by a cross scratched into the wall, by a hymn murmured in the dark, by the notation of a Venetian who could not help remembering. We close with the image that began this tale, a convent bell sounding across a landscape that had been altered by conquest. The bell's echo meets the carved cross in a subterranean chamber centuries later. Together, they form a dialogue between what authorities tried to remove and what ordinary people refused to let go. The secret ritual was the empire's slow choreography of renaming, reassigning, and recording absence. It aimed at a bureaucratic nullification of persons. But memory, in the hands of those who would not be fully catalogued, proved to be another kind of ritual, not of erasure, but of persistence. If this story moved you, leave a comment about what struck you most, and subscribe to follow more archive-driven histories that unearth voices forgotten by official books.